The fog clung to the moors like a shroud, thick and unyielding beneath the grey sky of late autumn 1842. Widow Eliza Everly trudged along the rutted path from the village of Eldridge Hollow, her boots sinking into the mud with each weary step. At 32, she bore the weight of her losses not just in her stooped shoulders but in the swaddled bundle pressed against her chest. The child, her daughter, born silent and still just 3 nights prior, felt heavier than any babe should, as if the earth's own sorrow had seeped into those tiny limbs. Eliza's dark hair, once neatly pinned, now straggled loose beneath her bonnet, framing a face etched with exhaustion. She hummed a tuneless lullaby, more to steady her own breath than to soothe the lifeless form. The cottage waited at the edge of the hollow, a squat stone building half swallowed by brambles, its thatched roof sagging like an old man's sigh. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign that Martha, the midwife who had delivered the stillbirth, lingered inside. Eliza pushed open the door with her elbow, the hinges creaking in protest. The room smelled of damp earth and boiled herbs, the fire and the grate casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn table. Martha looked up from stirring a pot, her broad face creased with concern. At 50, she was the village's anchor, her hands calloused from years of pulling life, or death, into the world. "Eliza, love, you've been out too long. The chills settle in your bones." She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room, reaching for the bundle. Eliza turned away instinctively, clutching it closer. "He's gone to the pub again," Eliza murmured, her voice flat as the moors. Her husband, Thomas, had taken to the ale since the fever claimed their first 2 children years ago. Now this, another loss, unspoken between them. She unwrapped the cloth just enough to gaze at the child's pale face, perfect in its stillness, the tiny mouth parted as if in a breath that never came. Martha nodded, her eyes softening. "Let me take her for a bit. You need rest." But Eliza shook her head, the motion sharp. She had carried the babe home from the birthing shed herself, refusing the churchyard burial the rector urged. "Not yet," she whispered. "She feels warm still." It was a lie, born of desperation, the skin had cooled hours ago. Yet in the dim light, Eliza swore she saw a faint flush on the cheeks. Night fell early, the moon a sliver behind the clouds as Eliza rocked in the chair by the fire. Thomas stumbled in past midnight, reeking of gin and regret. He glanced at the bundle in her arms, then away, muttering about the harvest yields. "Bury it tomorrow, Eliza. Can't keep haunting the place." He collapsed onto the pallet without another word, his snores soon rumbling like distant thunder. Eliza waited until the house grew still, then slipped outside with the child. The air bit sharp, carrying the scent of wet peat. She walked to the old yew tree at the garden's edge, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers. There, under the scant moonlight filtering through, she laid the bundle on the grass and knelt beside it. "My little one," she breathed, tracing the curve of an ear. The wind whispered through the leaves, and for a moment, silence pressed in, heavy, expectant. Then, a sound. Faint at first, like the mewl of a distant cat. Eliza froze, her heart stuttering. It came again, rising from the swaddling, a cry, thin and piercing, echoing only in the silvered light. The child's eyes, once glazed in death, fluttered open, milky but alive with some unnatural gleam. Eliza's breath caught, terror and wonder twisting in her chest. She gathered the babe up, the cry muffled against her breast, and hurried back inside before the moon dipped lower. But the sound lingered in her ears, a secret promise of something stirring in the dark. The fog clung to the moors like a shroud, muting the distant cry of a curlew as Widow Everly trudged homeward from the midwife's cottage. Her arms ached from the weight of the bundled form against her chest, swaddled tight in the coarse linen she'd sewn herself months ago, back when hope still flickered in her belly. The child, her Elias, though he'd never drawn a living breath, felt heavier now, as if the earth's pull had already begun to claim him. She whispered apologies into the folds, her voice lost to the wind that whipped her black shawl. The path to her isolated croft wound through gnarled hawthorns, their branches clawing at the twilight sky. Everly's boots sank into the mud, each step a labored pull, but she refused the lantern's glow. The moon would rise soon enough, and she trusted its pale light more than any flame. Behind her, the village lights winked like wary eyes, but she kept her gaze forward. The midwife's warnings echoed faintly, "Bury him quick, before the frost sets in," but Everly's heart rebelled. Elias deserved more than a hasty grave in unconsecrated ground, denied the churchyard for his untimely end. As she crested the hill, the croft came into view, a squat stone dwelling with a thatched roof sagging under recent rains, smoke no longer curling from the chimney since her husband's fever had taken him the winter before. Inside, the air would be stale, the hearth cold. She paused at the door, shifting Elias's weight, and fumbled with the iron latch. The hinges groaned like a lament as she entered, the darkness swallowing her whole. By the sliver of moonlight piercing the unshuttered window, she laid him on the trestle table, peeling back the swaddling with trembling fingers. His skin was cool, almost translucent, tiny veins tracing blue rivers beneath. So perfect, yet so still. Everly's throat tightened. She'd felt him kick once, fiercely, in the final weeks, as if protesting the world that awaited. Now, nothing. She traced his cheek, willing warmth to return, but only the chill of the room answered. A pot of stew from midday sat untouched on the sideboard, rabbit and roots, scavenged from the traps her husband had taught her to set. Hunger gnawed at her, but she ignored it, instead fetching a basin of water from the barrel by the door. The liquid sloshed as she carried it over, splashing her skirts. She washed him gently, humming the lullaby her mother had sung, the notes fracturing in the quiet. "Hush now, little one, the moon's your keeper." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Everly glanced up, half expecting her neighbor, old Tom, to come knocking with his nosy questions. He'd been by earlier that week, muttering about ill omens and the bad blood in her line, her husband's family, cursed by some old grudge with the laird. But Tom kept his distance tonight. Perhaps the fog had deterred him, or the whispers in the village about the widow who birthed a demon child. She dried Elias with a fresh cloth, her movements deliberate, as if delaying the inevitable could rewrite fate. The moon climbed higher, its beam stretching across the floor like a silver path. In its light, Elias's face seemed to soften, the corners of his mouth twitching, or was that a shadow playing tricks? Everly blinked, rubbing her eyes, exhaustion blurring the edges of sight. She'd not slept in days, not since the pains began at dusk 2 nights past. A soft sound escaped him then, a gurgle, faint as a bubble rising in water. She froze, hand hovering over his chest. Impossible. Stillborns didn't stir, the midwife had sworn it, pressing her stethoscope to the belly and shaking her head. Yet there it was again, a whimper, so quiet it might have been the settling of the thatch. Everly leaned closer, her breath held, the room's chill seeping into her bones. "Elias?" Her voice cracked, a plea more than a question. The sound came once more, drawn out, like a sigh from the depths. Moonlight bathed his form, turning his skin to porcelain, and for a heartbeat, his eyelids fluttered. Not open, not quite, but enough to send a shiver racing down her spine. She snatched him up, pressing him to her breast, rocking instinctively. "Hush, my love, Mama's here." The croft seemed smaller then, the walls pressing in, the air thick with unspoken dread. Everly paced the floorboards, murmuring reassurances, though her mind raced with fragments of village lore, tales of changelings swapped in the night, or spirits bound to the moon's pull. Her husband's stories, told by firelight, of the old ones who walked the moors, jealous of the living. She shook her head, banishing the thoughts. This was her son, flesh and blood, no matter what the rational world decreed. As the hour deepened, the whimpers grew sporadic, fading into silence with each pass of a cloud over the moon. Everly settled into the rocker by the window, Elias cradled close, her eyes fixed on the night sky. She wouldn't bury him, not yet. Not while the moon watched over them. But in the recesses of her weary mind, a seed of unease took root, what if the cries weren't joy, but a warning? What if the stillness was a mercy withheld? Dawn crept in reluctantly, gray and unforgiving, stripping the room of its ethereal glow. Elias lay quiet once more in her arms, as if the night had been a dream. Everly rose, stiff from the vigil, and placed him back on the table. She needed to fetch wood, to boil water, to pretend normalcy for the sake of the village tongues. But as she stepped toward the door, a final, faint mewl pierced the air, audible now even in the light. She turned, heart pounding, and saw his tiny hand twitch, fingers curling as if reaching for something unseen. The fog outside had lifted, revealing the moors in stark relief, but Everly's world narrowed to that small, stirring form. The lantern's flame guttered in the chill draft seeping through the cabin's warped planks, casting shadows that twisted like roots across the rough-hewn floor. Widow Everly sat by the hearth, her hands folded over the bundled form in her lap, the weight of it a familiar ache against her ribs. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the distant call of an owl, a sound that always made her pause, listening for echoes that weren't there. It had been 3 nights since the burial, or what passed for one in these forsaken woods, and sleep eluded her like a skittish deer. She rocked slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm with her breath. The child, her child, though the midwife had shaken her head and pronounced it gone before it ever drew air, lay swaddled in the finest linen she owned, stiff and unyielding. Everly had refused to let them take it away, not to the cold earth or the indifferent flames. "He's mine," she'd whispered to the empty room after they left, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. Now, in the quiet hours, she traced the outline of tiny limbs beneath the cloth, imagining the rise and fall that never came. A sliver of moonlight pierced the shutters, pale and insistent, slipping across the floor like spilled milk. Everly's gaze lifted, drawn to it against her will. The bundle stirred, or did it? She froze, heart thudding dully in her chest. No, just the wind shifting the fabric. But then, faint as a sigh, a sound escaped, a mewling, soft and wet, like a kitten blind and mewling for milk. Her breath caught. She unwrapped the cloth with careful hands, the air turning thick around her. In the moonlight's glow, the child's face gleamed unnaturally smooth, eyes sealed shut but mouth parted in what might have been a yawn. The cry came again, sharper this time, threading through the cabin's silence like a needle. Everly pressed it closer, her own tears blurring the sight. "Hush now," she murmured, though fear coiled in her gut. The pines outside rustled violently, as if the forest itself leaned in to listen. She didn't know what this was, resurrection or ruse, but in that moment, she held tighter, unwilling to question the miracle's cruel edge. Dawn was hours away, and the crying built, a rhythm that pulled at her bones, promising secrets only the night could keep. The lantern's flame guttered in the draft seeping through the cabin's warped boards, casting shadows that twisted like roots across the walls. Eliza Everly sat rigid in the rocker, her hands clasped over the bundled cloth in her lap, the small form she'd buried shallow that afternoon, only to unearth it again when the moon crested the ridge. The child, her child, had not stirred then, not in the daylight's harsh glare. But now, as silver light filtered through the grimy window, a faint mewling rose from the bundle, soft as a kitten's, yet laced with something deeper, more insistent. She rocked forward, breath held, peering at the face swaddled in muslin. The eyes were closed, the skin pale and cool to the touch, but the sound persisted, threading through the quiet like smoke. "Hush now," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. She'd told no one of the digging, not even Amos, the trapper who shared her roof these past months. He was out hunting coon, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he vanished into the treeline at dusk. Better that way. Folks in the hollow already whispered of her madness since the birth. Stillborn, the midwife had declared, wrapping it quick and hustling her to bed with laudanum. But Eliza had felt the kick, faint as a dream, right up to the end. The crying sharpened, pulling her from the memory. She unwrapped the cloth just enough to see the tiny chest rise and fall, not breathing, not truly, but quivering as if caught in a chill wind. Moonlight caught the edge of the cradle nearby, empty and mocking. Eliza's fingers trembled as she reached for the silver locket at her throat, the one her mother had worn through the fever that took her. "What do you want?" she murmured to the thing in her arms. It quieted for a moment, then wailed again, higher, drawing a shiver down her spine. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like bones. Footsteps crunched on the frost-kissed path, Amos, returning early. Eliza froze, heart pounding. She bundled the form tighter, shoving it beneath the quilt on her lap. The door creaked open, admitting a gust that snuffed the lantern half-low. Amos stamped snow from his boots, his bearded face ruddy from the cold, eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "Heard something queer out there," he said, hanging his coat on the peg. "Like a babe crying, in the woods." "Thought it was the wind at first." Eliza forced a nod, her throat dry. "Just the owls, likely. They sound mournful this time of year." She shifted in the chair, the bundle heavy against her knees. Amos grunted, moving to stoke the fire, but his gaze lingered on her, wary. He'd been cautious since the birth, tiptoeing around her silences, fetching water without complaint. Brave in the face of bears and blizzards, but this, her grief, the hollow superstitions, unsettled him. As the flames crackled back to life, the crying resumed, muffled but unmistakable, seeping from the quilt. Amos straightened, rifle still in hand from the hunt. "That ain't no owl." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his calloused hand brushing hers aside. The bundle tumbled free, the cloth falling open to reveal the small, lifeless form, lips parted in that eerie keen. Amos recoiled, color draining from his face. "Christ almighty, Eliza. What have you done?" The child thing's cry peaked, echoing off the rafters, and for the first time, Eliza saw fear in his eyes, not of the wild, but of what she'd brought into their home. Moonlight spilled fuller now, bathing the figure in a glow that made its skin shimmer unnaturally, as if dusted with frost. She reached for it, desperate, but Amos barred her way, his voice low and urgent. "We end this. Now. Before it wakes the dead for real." Yet as he spoke, the cabin's shadows deepened, coiling tighter around the hearth, and Eliza felt a pull in her chest, cold and insistent, binding her to the cry that only the night could hear. The lantern's flame flickered low in the vicarage study, casting jagged shadows across the oak bookshelves that lined the walls like silent sentinels. Widow Everly sat rigid in the high-backed chair, her hands clasped so tightly around a bundled shawl that her knuckles gleamed white. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp wool and old leather, undercut by the faint, metallic tang of fear that seemed to seep from her very skin. Reverend Hale paced before the hearth, his boots thudding softly on the threadbare rug, each step a measured echo of his mounting unease. "It's no natural thing," Everly whispered, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. She hadn't looked up since they'd arrived at dusk, her eyes fixed on the swaddled form in her lap. The child, or what passed for one, lay still as death, its tiny chest unmoving, yet she rocked it gently, as if soothing a restless sleeper. "He cries only when the moon touches him. Like a curse woven into the night itself." Hale stopped pacing and knelt before her, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd buried too many secrets in his sermons. He was the village's anchor, steady and devout, but tonight his faith felt like a fraying rope. "Mrs. Everly, we've spoken of this." The doctor examined the babe. "Stillborn," he said. "A tragedy, yes, but perhaps your grief, it plays tricks on the mind." His words were gentle, probing, yet they carried the weight of doubt he'd harbored since her frantic knock at his door 2 nights past. She lifted her gaze then, eyes hollowed by shadows that no firelight could chase away. "Tricks. I felt his breath on my cheek, Reverend. Cold as frost, but there. And the sound, oh, that wailing. It pulls at the soul, like the wind through a graveyard gate." Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the shawl, tucking it tighter around the small, unnaturally rigid shape. Outside, the wind howled against the leaded windows, rattling the panes as if the night itself conspired to listen. Hale glanced toward the door, where Eliza, the midwife, waited in the hall. She'd insisted on coming, her sturdy frame a bulwark against the widow's unraveling. Eliza had delivered the child 3 weeks ago, her hands steady even as the labor dragged into a silent horror. Now, she hovered like a ghost, arms crossed, her face a mask of practical resolve. "Let me see it again," she'd urged earlier, but Everly had recoiled, clutching the bundle as if it were her last tether to sanity. A low creak sounded from the corner, where the grandfather clock ticked relentlessly toward midnight. Hale rose, rubbing his temples. "The moon will rise soon. If there's truth to your words, we'll face it together. But burning the body, that's what the elders suggest. To end this affliction." He spoke the word carefully, avoiding the villagers' whispers of witchcraft that had slithered through the lanes like fog. Everly's laugh was brittle, a shard of glass in the quiet room. "Burn him? My son? And what if the cries follow me into the flames?" She stood abruptly, the chair scraping back like a protest. The bundle shifted in her arms, and for a heartbeat, Hale swore he saw a twitch beneath the fabric, a fleeting illusion, or something more. Eliza pushed into the room then, her apron stained with the day's labors, eyes sharp as she assessed the widow. "Enough talk of fires. We've a plan, Reverend. The salt circle in the garden, under the yew tree. If the moon calls it forth, we'll bind it there." Her voice was firm, laced with the no-nonsense grit of a woman who'd pulled life from death's grip more times than she cared to count. She'd drawn the circle herself that afternoon, chalk lines etched deep into the earth, ringed with iron nails scavenged from the blacksmith. Hale nodded, though his stomach twisted. Superstition, he told himself, a balm for frightened hearts. Yet as they stepped into the chill night, the moon cresting the hill like a pale spectre, he couldn't shake the dread coiling in his chest. The garden stretched dark and tangled, the yew's branches clawing at the stars. Everly moved to the circle's edge, hesitating, her breath misting in the air. "Place him down," Eliza instructed, her hand on the widow's shoulder, a rare touch of warmth. Everly knelt, unwrapping the shawl with agonizing slowness. The child's form emerged, pale and waxen, limbs folded as if in eternal prayer. No rise or fall, no spark of life. Hale murmured a prayer, the words tumbling out rote and hollow. Then the moonlight spilled over the circle, silvering the grass like spilled mercury. A hush fell, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Everly's hand flew to her mouth as a faint tremor rippled through the small body. The air thickened, charged, as if the night held its breath. It began as a whimper, soft as a sigh escaping a dream. Then it built, rising into a keen that clawed at the edges of Hale's mind, a cry not of pain, but of hunger, ancient and insatiable. The child's eyes snapped open, milky voids reflecting the moon, and its tiny mouth stretched wide, unleashing a wail that bent the shadows toward it. Eliza shoved iron into the dirt at the circle's edge, her face paling. "Hold the line," she barked, but Everly staggered back, tears carving tracks down her cheeks. The wailing intensified, pulling at them like invisible threads, urging them closer. Hale's cross burned hot against his chest, a warning or a lie, he couldn't tell. In that moment, as the cry pierced the veil between worlds, Hale realized the plan had already failed. The circle contained it, but the thing within was no mere babe, it was a doorway, and the moonlight was the key turning slow. The fog clung to the moors like a shroud, thick and unyielding, as Eliza Everly trudged toward the old chapel ruins. Her boots sank into the damp earth with each step, the weight of the bundled cloth against her chest a constant, unnatural pull. The child, her child, though the midwife had declared it lifeless hours after birth, stirred faintly beneath the layers, a whisper of movement that sent ice through her veins. It was midday, the sun a pale disk struggling through the haze, yet Eliza felt the moon's shadow already, as if the night bled into the day just for her. She had not slept since the cries began 3 nights past. The first had come under a sliver of moonlight slicing through her cottage window, a thin wail that pierced the silence like a needle. Not the lusty bellow of a newborn, but something hollow, echoing from a place deeper than lungs could reach. Eliza had rushed to the cradle, her hands trembling as she lifted the swaddled form. Its eyes, milky and unseeing, had fixed on her with a hunger that made her stagger back. By dawn, it was still again, cold as the grave. But the villagers whispered now, their eyes darting away when she passed with the market basket. "Witches get," old Mrs. Harrow had muttered behind her hand. Eliza ignored them, clutching the bundle tighter, driven by a fierce, inexplicable need to protect what should not be. The chapel lay a mile from the village, its stones crumbling under ivy and thyme, a forgotten relic from when the land was wilder. Father Thorne had mentioned it once, in a sermon about restless spirits, a place where the old ones buried their sins under the full moon. Eliza sought no priest's counsel, the local vicar had refused her at the door, crossing himself as if she carried plague. No, she came here on instinct, drawn by fragments of lullabies her own mother had sung, tales of babes lost to the fae, reclaimed only in shadowed hollows. As she crested the hill, the ruins emerged from the mist like jagged teeth. The arched doorway gaped open, vines twisting through the fractured altar within. Eliza paused, her breath fogging the air, and listened. The wind carried distant bleats from the sheep pens, but closer, a faint rustle, like dry leaves skittering across stone. She stepped inside, the bundle heavy in her arms, and the air grew cooler, tasting of earth and decay. In the nave, shafts of muted light filtered through the roof's gaps, illuminating motes that danced like lost souls. Eliza knelt by the altar, its surface etched with faded crosses, and gently unwrapped the cloth. The child's form lay pale and waxen, limbs curled as if in eternal sleep. Its tiny chest did not rise, yet Eliza's heart pounded with dread. "What are you?" she whispered, brushing a lock of damp hair from its forehead. The skin was clammy, unnaturally smooth, like polished marble chilled by a crypt. A shadow shifted at the edge of her vision, Thomas, her late husband's brother, emerging from the side aisle where he'd been waiting. He was a sturdy man, broad-shouldered from years mending fences on the estate, but his face had hollowed since Elias's death in the mill accident. Cautious by nature, Thomas had always deferred to his brother, but now, with Eliza alone, a quiet resolve hardened his jaw. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said, his voice low, edged with worry. He carried a lantern, unlit, and a small shovel slung over his shoulder, the tools for what he believed must be done. "I had to," Eliza replied, not looking up. Her voice cracked, but she steadied it, drawing on the stubborn grit that had seen her through Elias's fevered last days. "It moved again this morning, Thomas. In the light of day. It's not gone." Thomas knelt beside her, his calloused hand hovering before touching her shoulder. He was no stranger to loss, his own wife had miscarried twice before fleeing to the city, but this was different, a wrongness that twisted his gut. "Eliza, love, it's the grief speaking. The babe's at peace. We bury it proper, say the words, and let the earth take it." His eyes flicked to the form, and he swallowed hard, masking his unease with practicality. "The moon's not risen yet. Best we do this now, before dark." She shook her head, fingers tracing the child's cheek. A faint tremor rippled beneath the skin, like a fish gliding just below water's surface. Eliza's breath hitched. "Listen," she urged, pulling the cloth aside further. The ruins fell silent, save for the distant call of a crow. Then, from the bundle, a soft sigh escaped, not a cry, but a breath, ragged and waiting. Thomas recoiled, the shovel clattering against stone. "God preserve us," he muttered, crossing himself despite his lapsed faith. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "That's no babe's sound. It's pulling at you, Eliza. Like the stories of the changelings. We end this." But as he reached for the bundle, the air thickened, the motes swirling faster into a vortex that tugged at their clothes. The child's eyes fluttered open, not milky now, but gleaming with an inner pallor, reflecting the faint light like twin moons. A low keen began, building from its throat, vibrating through the stones. Eliza froze, torn between horror and a maternal ache that clawed at her ribs. Thomas swung the shovel, aiming to cover it, to smother the sound, but the ground beneath them shuddered, cracked spiderwebbing from the altar as if the earth itself recoiled. They stumbled back, the keen rising to a wail that echoed off the walls, not of pain, but of ancient, insatiable want. Eliza clutched the bundle to her breast, shielding it instinctively, even as tears burned her eyes. The moon, though hidden, seemed to pulse in her blood, urging her onward. Thomas's face paled, his caution fracturing into fear. "We can't stay," he gasped, the words half lost in the rising storm of sound. The moon hung low over the moors, a bloated silver disk that painted the heather in ghostly strokes. Widow Everly clutched the bundled shawl tighter against her chest, the weight within it heavier than any child should be. Elias trudged beside her, his lantern swinging like a pendulum, casting erratic shadows that danced across the uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, decay, perhaps, or the faint rot of secrets unearthed. They had left the village behind hours ago, following the old shepherd's path that twisted toward Blackthorn Hollow, where the midwife had sworn the cries originated on nights like this. Elias paused to wipe sweat from his brow, though the chill bit deep into their bones. "We should turn back, ma'am," he muttered, his voice low, as if the wind might carry it to unwelcome ears. He was the cautious one, always had been, the stable hand who'd lingered too long at her door after her husband's burial, offering quiet help without expectation. His eyes, dark and steady, flicked to the bundle. "This ain't right. The babe's gone, God rest it. Chasen, ghosts won't bring him breathin'. Everly's steps faltered, but she pressed on, her boots sinking into the soft turf. The shawl rustled faintly, and she imagined the tiny form shifting, though she knew better. It had been still since the birth 3 nights past, blue-lipped and silent under the doctor's grim pronouncement. Yet the cries, high, keening wails that pierced the midnight quiet of her cottage, had started the very hour the moon crested the hill. Not from the cradle, but from the earth itself, or so the neighbors whispered, crossing themselves as they passed her gate. "I heard it again last eve," she said, her words clipped, breath fogging in the cold. "From the hollow. Clear as a living soul." Her hand trembled on the bundle. Bravery wasn't her trait, not truly, but grief had forged something unyielding in her chest. The village elders had called it a curse, the stillborn a mark of her unspoken sins, perhaps the child her late husband had begged for, or the barren years that followed his fevered death. They offered no aid, only averted eyes and locked doors. Elias was the only one who'd come when she sent word, his loyalty a quiet anchor in the storm. A gust whipped across the moor, carrying a distant echo, a thin, wavering cry that twisted like smoke through the night. Elias froze, the lantern's flame guttering. "That ain't the wind," he said, gripping her arm. His fingers were calloused, warm against her chilled skin. They crested a rise, and Blackthorn Hollow unfolded below, a sunken bowl of twisted trees, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Moonlight pooled in the center, illuminating a ring of stones that hadn't been tended since her girlhood tales. Everly descended first, the slope pulling her forward with unnatural insistence. The cries grew louder, threading through the rustle of leaves, not from one direction but all, as if the hollow breathed them out. She knelt at the stone circle's edge, unwrapping the shawl with deliberate care. The stillborn lay pale and perfect, its tiny fists curled as in sleep. "If it's you, Callan, my love," she whispered, "show me why." Elias hung back, scanning the shadows. "Ma'am, this place, folks say the old ones buried their dead here, before the church came. Unbaptized." His voice cracked on the last word, caution warring with the pull of her resolve. A branch snapped nearby, and he spun, lantern raised. Nothing stirred, but the air thickened, pressing against their lungs like an unseen hand. She placed the bundle in the circle's heart, where the moonlight struck purest. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by their ragged breaths. Then it came, a sob, raw and infantile, rising from the earth beneath the stones. The ground trembled faintly, pebbles skittering like frightened insects. Everly reached out, her fingers brushing the cold fabric, and felt a warmth bloom where none should be, a pulse, faint as a moth's wing. Elias dropped to one knee beside her, his wit deserting him in the face of the uncanny. "It's movin'. Lord help us, it's movin'." The cries sharpened, no longer echo but demand, pulling at something deep within her, a maternal ache that twisted into dread. Shadows lengthened in a circle, coiling like roots seeking purchase, and the first stone shifted, grinding against its neighbor with a sound like breaking bone. They scrambled back as the earth buckled, a seam splitting the moonlight's pool. From it rose a mist, pale and shimmering, shaping itself into forms too vague to name, whispers of limbs, eyes that gleamed with borrowed light. Everly's heart hammered. This was no mere haunting, but a unraveling, the boundary between her loss and the hollow's hunger blurring. Elias hauled her up, his arm around her waist, but the mist followed, tendrils brushing their ankles with icy insistence. "Run," he urged, but she hesitated, torn between flight and the voice that now mimicked her unborn child's, hers, yet laced with an ancient, insatiable grief. The stones groaned louder, the circle widening like a maw, and in its depths, the bundle stirred once more, the shawl falling away to reveal skin that glowed faintly, unnaturally, under the moon's unblinking gaze. The moon hung low that night, a bloated silver disk pressing against the frost-laced windowpanes of the Everly cottage. Widow Everly sat by the cradle, her fingers twisted in the hem of her shawl, the wool worn thin from too many anxious clutches. The child, her child, though the midwife had sworn it came still and silent, stirred beneath the threadbare blanket. Elias, the village carpenter who'd lingered too long after mending the door, paced the creaking floorboards behind her, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the night pressed down on him alone. "It's stirring again," she whispered, her voice a threadbare plea. The air in the room thickened with the scent of damp earth and lye soap, the fire in the hearth sputtering as if afraid to crackle too loudly. Elias stopped his pacing, his calloused hand resting on the back of her chair, warm and steady despite the chill that seeped through the walls. "Best not wake it fully," he murmured, his eyes flicking to the window where shadows twisted like reaching fingers. He'd come every night since the burial that wasn't a burial, since the ground had rejected the tiny coffin and the babe had wailed under the moon's pale gaze. The villagers whispered of curses, of the widow's grief twisting into something unholy, but Elias stayed, driven by a stubborn loyalty born of shared glances in the market square before her husband fell to the fever. A soft mewling rose from the cradle, not the robust cry of a living infant but a hollow keen, like wind through a cracked bone. Everly leaned closer, her breath catching as the blanket shifted. The child's skin gleamed unnaturally, pale as moonlight itself, veins threading blue beneath the surface like rivers frozen in winter. It had no warmth, no pulse she could feel in those fragile limbs, yet here it was, eyes fluttering open, milky, unseeing, fixed on the sliver of night sky beyond the glass. "Elias," she said, sharper now, "the shutters. Close them tight." He moved without question, his boots thudding softly as he latched the wooden panels, blocking the moon's intrusive light. But the cry persisted, rising in pitch, a sound that clawed at the edges of her sanity. It wasn't hunger or pain, it was something older, a lament that echoed the widow's own unspoken sorrows, the stillbirths before this one, the husband lost to the coughing sickness, the isolation of a woman marked by loss. He returned to her side, kneeling to peer into the cradle. "What does it want, Mary? Truly?" His voice held no accusation, only the quiet bewilderment of a man who'd hammered nails into coffins but never faced one that refused to stay shut. Everly shook her head, tears carving warm paths down her cheeks. She tried milk from the goat, swaddling it in her husband's old shirt, even murmuring prayers from the tattered Bible on the mantel. Nothing soothed it save the moon's retreat at dawn, when it would slump limp and silent once more. From outside, a dog's distant bark cut the night, followed by the crunch of footsteps on the frozen path. Elias tensed, his hand dropping to the axe he'd left by the door, not for chopping wood tonight, but for whatever might come knocking. Reverend Hale, he guessed, low and urgent. Heard him preaching fire and brimstone at the tavern yesterday. Said the devil walks in forms we cradle close. Everly's grip tightened on the shawl. The Reverend had visited once before, his gaunt face shadowed by the steeple hat, demanding to see the abomination. She'd barred the door then, but the cries had drawn eyes, whispers turning to accusations. If he came now, with the moon full and the babe wailing? She rose, swaying slightly, and crossed to the door, pressing her ear to the wood. The footsteps paused, then retreated, swallowed by the wind-whipped pines. Relief flooded her, short-lived. The cry sharpened, piercing, as if the child sensed the peril averted. Elias lifted it gently from the cradle, the tiny form light as a husk in his arms. "Hush now," he cooed, awkward but earnest, rocking it as he'd seen mothers do in the village. For a moment, the keening softened, the child's head lolling against his chest. Everly watched, a flicker of hope warring with dread in her chest. Perhaps it was binding to him, this man who'd offered no promises but showed up all the same. But then the moon slipped free of a cloud, its light seeping through the shutter's cracks like silver veins. The child's eyes snapped wide, and the cry erupted anew, not just sound, but a force that rattled the cups on the shelf, sent shadows dancing wildly. Elias staggered, clutching it closer, his face draining of color. "Mary, it's cold. Burning cold, like frostbite from the inside." She snatched a quilt from the bed, wrapping it around them both, her hands trembling as she pulled them toward the hearth. The fire leaped higher, unnaturally, flames twisting toward the window as if drawn by the moon's pull. Outside, the wind howled in answer, branches scraping the roof like nails on slate. Everly met Elias's gaze over the bundle, seeing her own fear mirrored there, the realization that this was no mere haunting, but a tether, pulling them into something vast and unforgiving. As the cry peaked, a crack split the air, the shutter giving way, moonlight flooding the room in a cold cascade. The child arched in Elias's arms, its mouth opening wide, revealing not teeth but a void, endless and starless. Everly screamed then, not in terror, but in defiance, lunging to shield them both. In that instant, the night seemed to hold its breath, the boundaries between the living cottage and the moonlit wild blurring into one. The moon hung low over the Everly cottage, its silver light slicing through the cracks in the shutters like accusatory fingers. Eliza Everly clutched the bundled form to her chest, the weight of it both familiar and alien after these long weeks. The child, her child, though the midwife had declared it gone before the first breath, stirred faintly against the woolen shawl, a twitch that sent ice through her veins. She had buried it once, in the soft earth behind the barn, under a cairn of river stones. But the cries had pulled her back each full moon, soft and insistent, like a lamb calling from the mist. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path outside, deliberate and unhurried. Eliza froze, her breath shallow in the dim room lit only by the hearth's dying embers. It was Dr. Harlan again, the third night this week. He had come unbidden since the whispers started in the village, his face etched with that false concern she had come to despise. "Mrs. Everly," he called through the door, his voice muffled but firm, "we must speak. The constable is asking questions. Folks say they've heard sounds." She didn't answer, pressing her ear to the bundle. Silence from within, but she felt the subtle rise and fall, as if it listened too. The door creaked open, she hadn't locked it, hadn't the strength, and Harlan stepped in, his lantern casting long shadows that danced like specters on the walls. He was a tall man, gaunt from years of tending the fevered and the forsaken, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Eliza, this cannot go on. The grave was empty when I checked yesterday. If you've disturbed it, disturbed." Her voice cracked, sharper than intended. She rose from the rocker, the bundle secure in her arms. "You think I dug it up for sport? It came back, doctor. On its own. Crying for me under the moon." Harlan set the lantern on the table, its glow illuminating the sparse room, the threadbare quilt on the bed, the Bible untouched since her husband's passing, the basin of water still stained from the birth. He approached slowly, hands outstretched as if calming a skittish horse. "Grief plays tricks. I've seen it before, women clutching at shadows after loss. Let me help you lay it to rest properly this time. The bundle shifted again, a small hand, cold, unnaturally so, brushing against her ribs through the fabric. Eliza's heart hammered. She backed toward the window, where moonlight pooled on the sill like spilled milk. You don't believe me. None of you do. But listen, wait for the light to touch it. Harlan's brow furrowed, but he paused, glancing at the shutters. Outside, the wind whispered through the oaks, carrying the distant hoot of an owl. The room grew colder, the fire sputtering as if choked. Then, as the moon crested higher, a sliver of light pierced the gap, falling across the bundle. A sound escaped, faint at first, a mewling whimper that built into a wail, piercing and raw, like glass shattering in the night. The doctor's face paled, his hand flying to his mouth. He stumbled back, knocking the lantern askew, oil spilled, flames licking at the tablecloth. God preserve us, he muttered, crossing himself despite his rationalist's pride. The cry swelled, echoing off the rafters, not the helpless gurgle of an infant but something older, hungrier, laced with a sorrow that clawed at the soul. Eliza rocked the form gently, tears streaming down her face. See. It's alive in the moonlight. My baby, return to me. But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her, the skin beneath the shawl felt looser now, the cries holding an edge that wasn't quite human. Harlan recovered, snatching a poker from the hearth to douse the growing fire. This is no miracle, Eliza. It's unnatural. We must end it, burn the remains, scatter the ashes. Before it draws worse upon you. She whirled on him, the bundle clutched tighter. Touch it, and you'll regret it. It's mine to bear. The cry peaked, then cut off abruptly as clouds veiled the moon. Silence descended, heavy as fog. Harlan straightened, his eyes darting to the door. Tomorrow, at dawn. I'll bring the priest. You can't hide this forever. He fled into the night, leaving the door ajar, the chill seeping in. Eliza sank to the floor, the bundle still in her arms. In the darkness, it lay quiescent, but she felt its pull, a tether drawing her deeper into the shadows. The village lights flickered in the distance, oblivious, but she knew Harlan's words would spread like fever. Dawn would bring them all, constable, priest, the curious and the fearful. And under the next moon, the cries would call again, louder, demanding what she could not yet name. The wind howled through the cracks in the attic beams, carrying the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like iron left too long in the rain. Eliza Everly pressed her back against the splintered wall, her fingers white-knuckled around the lantern's handle. The flame inside flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced like fingers reaching for her throat. Below, in the house's shadowed heart, the crying had started again, not the soft, mournful wail of before, but a sharper keen, laced with an impatience that twisted her gut. She'd come up here to hide the bundle, the swaddled thing she'd unearthed from the garden that afternoon, its tiny form cold and unyielding as the clay around it. But the attic felt no safer now, with the moonlight slicing through the slatted window like a blade. Elias, her brother-in-law, had followed her up the stairs, his boots thudding heavily despite his whispers. He was the cautious one, always had been, his broad face etched with lines from years of farm labor and quiet worry. Eliza, we can't keep running from it, he murmured, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. He clutched the shovel like a talisman, its blade still caked with the grave's dark soil. The cry pierced the floorboards, closer this time, echoing up from the parlor where they'd left the parlor door ajar. It wasn't human, not quite, too rhythmic, too insistent, like a lullaby sung backward. Eliza's breath caught as she remembered the midwife's words from that long-ago night, "It's gone, love. Still as the grave." But graves didn't weep under the moon. She shifted, the floor creaking beneath her, and the bundle in her arms stirred. No, it couldn't. She tightened her grip, feeling the faint, impossible warmth seeping through the linens. Elias edged toward the window, peering out at the silver-washed yard. The old oak loomed there, its branches clawing at the sky, and beneath it, the mound they tried to refill looked disturbed, as if something had clawed its way halfway out. "The doctor's coming at dawn," he said, more to himself than her. "He'll know what to make of this madness." But his voice wavered. The doctor from town had already dismissed her ravings once, calling it grief's cruel jest. Now, with Elias bearing witness, perhaps belief would follow. Yet doubt gnawed at him, visible in the way his free hand trembled against the sill. A soft thump sounded from below, like bare feet padding across the rug. Eliza's heart hammered. She set the lantern down, its light pooling like spilled milk on the dusty planks, and crept to the trapdoor. Peering through the gap, she saw nothing but the staircase's curve, swallowed by shadow. The crying swelled, pulling at her like a tide, urging her down. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Brave in her isolation, she'd faced the emptiness of widowhood alone, but this was a hunger that mirrored her own unspoken loss. Elias pulled her back, his grip firm on her shoulder. "We wait it out. Up here, it's just us and the night." But even as he spoke, the moonlight shifted, bathing the bundle in its glow. A faint gurgle rose from within, not a cry, but a laugh, wet, bubbling, as if the thing inside savored the game. Eliza froze, her mind reeling. The plan to bury it deeper, to end the cycle, had failed in the garden. The earth had rejected it, spitting roots and stones in defiance. Now, trapped in the attic's confines, adaptation meant facing it head-on, or losing what little sanity remained. The thump came again, nearer the stairs. Elias raised the shovel, his jaw set, but his eyes betrayed the fear. "Together, then," he said, and they descended into the waiting dark, the cry wrapping around them like a shroud. Outside, the moon climbed higher, indifferent to the fragile line between the living and the lost. The moon hung low that night, bloated and unyielding, its silver light spilling through the cracked windowpanes like spilled milk. Eliza Everly clutched the bundled form to her chest, the weight of it both heavier and lighter than any living child should be. The farmhouse groaned under the wind's assault, timbers whispering secrets she dared not hear. Her hands, calloused from years of tilling barren soil, trembled as she rocked in the oak chair by the hearth. The fire had died to embers hours ago, but she dared not stoke it. Light would chase the shadows, and the shadows were her only allies now. Footsteps echoed from the stairs, heavy and deliberate. It was Father Harlan, his boots caked with the mud of the churchyard path. He'd come unbidden, as he had every full moon since that cursed autumn birth. His face, etched with lines deeper than the graves he tended, bore the strain of a man wrestling demons he couldn't name. "Eliza," he murmured, his voice a gravelly anchor in the dim room. "The crying, it's begun again, hasn't it?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the swaddled bundle. The thin cries pierced the air, not from lungs but from somewhere hollow, echoing as if the child wept from the bottom of a well. They came only under the moon's gaze, faint at first, like a distant lament, building to a wail that clawed at the mind. Eliza had learned to endure it, to hum old cradle songs until her throat rawed, but tonight the sound carried a new edge, sharp, insistent, as if demanding release. Harlan knelt beside her, his black cassock pooling like ink on the floorboards. He reached out, hesitating, then placed a hand on the bundle. The crying stuttered, then swelled. "The right," he said, his breath fogging the chill air. "We must try it again. The salt circle, the prayers, perhaps this time it'll hold." His eyes, shadowed by fatigue, met hers. He'd been her confessor since Elias died in the cholera outbreak, the only soul who'd believed her tale of the stillborn that wouldn't stay silent. But belief had worn thin. Last moon, the circle had cracked, and something had slithered in the dark, leaving claw marks on the door. Eliza's caution warred with desperation. She was no fool. 28 years on this forsaken New England plot had taught her the perils of meddling with the unseen. Yet the cries burrowed deeper each cycle, stirring visions in her sleep, the child rising, pale and eyeless, its tiny fists pounding against her ribs from within. "And if it fails," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "What then, father? Do we burn the house with us in it?" He didn't answer, only rose to fetch the satchel from the corner. Inside lay the tools of his makeshift exorcism, vials of holy water, a silver crucifix etched with runes from forgotten tomes, and the coarse salt harvested from the sea caves. Eliza watched as he traced the circle on the floor, the grains forming a barrier that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The bundle in her arms grew restless, the cries modulating into a rhythmic keen that mimicked a heartbeat, her own, or its. As Harlan began the incantation, Latin words tumbling from his lips like stones into a void, the air thickened. The room's corners deepened, shadows coiling like smoke. Eliza felt it first in her bones, a pull, as if the child yearned not for peace, but for her. She tightened her grip, whispering, "Hush now, little one. Mama's here." But the words tasted like ash. The stillborn had never nursed, never blinked, yet its presence infested her every breath. The rite faltered midway. Harlan's voice hitched, his hand shaking as he sprinkled the water. A hiss rose from the circle's edge, and the salt line buckled, grains scattering like fleeing insects. The crying exploded into a shriek that rattled the windows, the bundle convulsing in Eliza's arms. She staggered to her feet, heart pounding, as a chill seeped through the floorboards, not wind, but something colder, older, rising from below. "Break it!" Harlan shouted, lunging for the crucifix. But the shadows surged, wrapping around his ankles. He fell, his prayers dissolving into gasps. Eliza backed toward the door, the bundle heavy now, alive with unnatural vigor. Moonlight flooded the room, illuminating the horror, the swaddling cloth unfurled slightly, revealing not flesh, but a pallid translucence, veined with moonlight itself. She fled into the night, the farmhouse door banging shut behind her. The field stretched black and endless, cornstalks whispering accusations. The cries followed, no longer confined to the house, they echoed in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, drawing her deeper into the moon's embrace. Harlan's distant shouts faded, swallowed by the dark. Alone now, Eliza ran, the weight in her arms both curse and kin, its wail a siren's call to whatever end awaited under that merciless sky. The moonlight spilled through the cracked window like spilled milk, pale and unforgiving, turning the bedroom into a silver-washed tomb. Widow Everly clutched the bundle tighter, her arms aching from the weight that never lightened, the child's form cold and unyielding against her chest. Elias stood by the door, his lantern flickering low, the flame dancing shadows across his weathered face. Brave Elias, who had followed her into the fog-shrouded woods 3 nights past, whispering promises of normalcy even as the cries began. Beside him, Martha, the midwife with her cautious eyes and steady hands, gripped the iron poker from the hearth, its tip still glowing faintly from the fire they'd banked hours ago. The cry came again, not from the bundle, but from everywhere and nowhere, a thin, keening wail that seeped through the floorboards, rattling the loose panes. Everly's breath hitched. She'd carried this secret for weeks, the stillborn son she'd buried shallow under the yew tree, only for the earth to reject him come moonrise. It wasn't grief that animated him now, but something older, hungrier, drawn by the light that bathed the room. The air thickened, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay, and Everly felt the first tug, like invisible threads pulling at her skirts. "We end it tonight," Elias said, his voice low but firm, stepping forward with the salt vial in one hand. He'd scavenged it from the church ruins after their first failed rite, the one where the thing had slipped from the grave, its tiny form twisting unnaturally, eyes like polished obsidian reflecting the moon. Martha nodded, her face pale but set. She'd seen enough births gone wrong in this forsaken village to know when to trust instinct over prayer. "The circle first," she murmured, tracing the chalk lines they'd renewed on the floorboards, the symbols borrowed from her grandmother's forbidden book, wards against the unresting dead. Everly knelt in the center, the bundle laid before her on the threadbare quilt. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the linen, revealing the small, bluish body, limbs stiff yet somehow pliant under the lunar glow. The cry sharpened, vibrating in her bones, and she whispered the name she'd given him in the quiet hours, Thomas. Not to summon, but to sever. Elias poured the salt in a ring around them, grains scattering like brittle bones, while Martha chanted the words in halting Latin, her voice gaining strength as the shadows deepened. The thing stirred. Its chest rose in a mockery of breath, tiny fingers curling toward the light. Everly's heart pounded. This was the cost they'd all paid, the isolation, the whispers from the villagers who'd fled after the second cry echoed through the hollow. Elias had lost his farmhand to fear, Martha her reputation as healer. And Everly, she'd lost the last shred of her old life, the widow's veil now a shroud for something worse. But they were here, bound by necessity, not sentiment. It lunged, faster than the eye could track, a blur of pallid skin and elongated shadow, aiming for the window where the moon hung full and indifferent. Elias swung the lantern, shattering it against the creature's side, oil flared, and for a moment, the wail turned to a screech, the smell of singed cloth filling the room. Martha thrust the poker forward, the iron biting into its arm, drawing no blood but eliciting a hiss like steam from a kettle. Everly seized the moment, her cautious resolve hardening into something fierce. She grabbed the silver locket from her neck, the one etched with her late husband's initials, and pressed it to the thing's forehead. The contact burned. The creature recoiled, its form flickering, the moonlight warping around it like heat haze. "By blood and bond, be still," Everly gasped, the words coming unbidden, pulled from the depths of her grief. Elias and Martha closed in, salt scattering anew, their chants overlapping in a ragged harmony. The wail peaked, shaking the rafters, but the wards held, the circle glowed faintly, a barrier of intent against the unnatural pull. Slowly, the struggle ebbed. The small body slumped, limbs going slack once more, the cry fading to a whisper that dissolved into the night wind. Everly rapped it again, her tears hot on the cold linen, but there was no triumph, only a hollow quiet. Elias extinguished the last embers with his boot, his hands shaking now that the deed was done. Martha leaned on the poker, exhaustion etching lines deeper into her face. Dawn crept in, gray and reluctant, chasing the moon from the sky. They buried the bundle deeper this time, under layers of earth and stone at the hill's edge, far from the U. The village stirred below, smoke rising from chimneys, oblivious or unwilling to remember. Everly walked back alone, the weight lifted but the ache lingering, a scar on her soul, a reminder that some losses cried forever in the hidden hours. Elias and Martha would stay, their alliance forged in fire, but the nights ahead would hold their own shadows, watchful and waiting. Widow Everly clutched the bundle tighter, her arms aching from the weight that never lightened, the child's form cold and unyielding against her chest. Elias stood by the door, his lantern flickering low, the flame dancing shadows across his weathered face. Brave Elias, who had followed her into the fog-shrouded woods 3 nights past, whispering promises of normalcy even as the cries began. Beside him, Martha, the midwife with her cautious eyes and steady hands, gripped the iron poker from the hearth, its tip still glowing faintly from the fire they'd banked hours ago. The cry came again, not from the bundle, but from everywhere and nowhere, a thin, keening wail that seeped through the floorboards, rattling the loose panes. Everly's breath hitched. She'd carried this secret for weeks, the stillborn son she'd buried shallow under the yew tree, only for the earth to reject him come moonrise. It wasn't grief that animated him now, but something older, hungrier, drawn by the light that bathed the room. The air thickened, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay, and Everly felt the first tug, like invisible threads pulling at her skirts. "We end it tonight," Elias said, his voice low but firm, stepping forward with the salt vial in one hand. He'd scavenged it from the church ruins after their first failed rite, the one where the thing had slipped from the grave, its tiny form twisting unnaturally, eyes like polished obsidian reflecting the moon. Martha nodded, her face pale but set. She'd seen enough births gone wrong in this forsaken village to know when to trust instinct over prayer. "The circle first," she murmured, tracing the chalk lines they'd renewed on the floorboards, the symbols borrowed from her grandmother's forbidden book, wards against the unresting dead. Everly knelt in the center, the bundle laid before her on the threadbare quilt. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the linen, revealing the small, bluish body, limbs stiff yet somehow pliant under the lunar glow. The cry sharpened, vibrating in her bones, and she whispered the name she'd given him in the quiet hours, Thomas. Not to summon, but to sever. Elias poured the salt in a ring around them, grains scattering like brittle bones, while Martha chanted the words in halting Latin, her voice gaining strength as the shadows deepened. The thing stirred. Its chest rose in a mockery of breath, tiny fingers curling toward the light. Everly's heart pounded. This was the cost they'd all paid, the isolation, the whispers from the villagers who'd fled after the second cry echoed through the hollow. Elias had lost his farmhand to fear, Martha her reputation as healer. And Everly, she'd lost the last shred of her old life, the widow's veil now a shroud for something worse. But they were here, bound by necessity, not sentiment. It lunged, faster than the eye could track, a blur of pallid skin and elongated shadow, aiming for the window where the moon hung full and indifferent. Elias swung the lantern, shattering it against the creature's side, oil flared, and for a moment, the wail turned to a screech, the smell of singed cloth filling the room. Martha thrust the poker forward, the iron biting into its arm, drawing no blood but eliciting a hiss like steam from a kettle. Everly seized the moment, her cautious resolve hardening into something fierce. She grabbed the silver locket from her neck, the one etched with her late husband's initials, and pressed it to the thing's forehead. The contact burned. The creature recoiled, its form flickering, the moonlight warping around it like heat haze. By blood and bond, be still, Everly gasped, the words coming unbidden, pulled from the depths of her grief. Elias and Martha closed in, salt scattering anew, their chants overlapping in a ragged harmony. The wail peaked, shaking the rafters, but the wards held, the circle glowed faintly, a barrier of intent against the unnatural pull. Slowly, the struggle ebbed. The small body slumped, limbs going slack once more, the cry fading to a whisper that dissolved into the night wind. Everly rapped it again, her tears hot on the cold linen, but there was no triumph, only a hollow quiet. Elias extinguished the last embers with his boot, his hands shaking now that the deed was done. Martha leaned on the poker, exhaustion etching lines deeper into her face. Dawn crept in, gray and reluctant, chasing the moon from the sky. They buried the bundle deeper this time, under layers of earth and stone at the hill's edge, far from the U. The village stirred below, smoke rising from chimneys, oblivious or unwilling to remember. Everly walked back alone, the weight lifted but the ache lingering, a scar on her soul, a reminder that some losses cried forever in the hidden hours. Elias and Martha would stay, their alliance forged in fire, but the nights ahead would hold their own shadows, watchful and waiting.